Vanessa waited until the string quartet lowered their bows before she destroyed my life in front of 200 people. "I've been disgusted by you since our first night together," she said, loud enough that the microphone barely mattered. 12 years, Daniel. 12 years of pretending. I smiled. I actually smiled. And I watched 300 faces in the Belmont room try to figure out if this was some kind of scripted bit for our anniversary. I turned to the venue's events director, standing near the stage, gave her the nod we'd agreed on that afternoon. The projector behind the head table flickered to life. Vanessa's face changed the second she saw the screen. Not confusion, recognition. She knew exactly what was coming. Because for one single week, she thought she'd won. She hadn't. I didn't know it yet. Standing there in my rented tuxedo, watching my wife's hands start to shake. But by November, one of us would be sworn in as the next mayor of Richmond. The other would be explaining herself to a grand jury. Let me back up. Because this didn't start in a ballroom in the Fan District, it started 6 days earlier. A quiet Sunday morning in April. A house on Larkspur Avenue that I thought belonged to two people who loved each other. My name's Daniel Whitfield. I'm 45 years old. I've spent 9 years on the Richmond City Council, representing a district that runs from Ashcombe down through Millbridge. 3 weeks before that anniversary dinner, I'd filed the paperwork to run for mayor. Not because I needed the title, because I genuinely believed I could do more for this city from the top floor of City Hall than I ever could from a council seat. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how naive that sounds now. Vanessa and I got married in the spring of 2013. Back when I was a 29-year-old aide answering phones for a council member who's long since retired. She was 30, working in strategic communications, whatever that meant back then. Sharp in a way that made every room she walked into feel smaller. My mother, Eleanor, told me on my wedding day that Vanessa had a look in her eye like she was already 3 moves ahead. I told my mother she was being paranoid. I was wrong about a lot of things that week. That was the first. We had a son together, Eli, who's 11 now and thinks his dad's job is boring meetings, which most days is a fair assessment. Sunday morning, the 4th of the 6 days I mentioned. Started normal. Coffee. Eli's travel soccer schedule taped to the fridge. Vanessa on her second phone call of the day before I'd even poured a second cup. "I've got a headache," she told me around 11. Rubbing her temple in that way she did when she wanted the conversation over. "I'm going to lie down for a bit. Take some Tylenol," I told her, already half focused on a briefing memo about the transit bond. I didn't think about it again until I went upstairs a couple hours later, looking for my charging cable. I found her phone sitting on the nightstand, face up, unlocked. That never happened. Vanessa treated that phone like it was bolted to her hand. A message sitting right there on the screen. From a contact saved simply as Shadow. "Can't wait for the debrief tonight. Wear the blue dress. The donors love it. So do I." My stomach did something I didn't have a name for yet. I stood there in my own bedroom, holding my wife's phone, telling myself there were 100 boring explanations. Campaign consultants use code names sometimes. It's a joke. It's nothing. I want to tell you, I put the phone down right there. I didn't. I opened the thread. Weeks of it. Months, actually. Going back to January. Photos I won't describe in detail, out of respect for my son, who will one day be old enough to read about his own family online. Messages that made it clear Shadow wasn't a campaign consultant. He was Colin Marsh, 39 years old, campaign manager for Gordon Ashford, the man running against me for mayor. My wife had been sleeping with my opponent's campaign manager for months. That alone would have flattened most men. It didn't flatten me nearly as much as the next message I scrolled to, dated 3 days earlier. Vanessa. Just 8 more days. Let him have his stupid anniversary dinner. The morning after. We dropped the donor file to the ledger. Gordon wants it timed with the filing deadline, so it looks like Daniel's been hiding contributions for months. Colin. Gordon's thrilled, says you're the best investment he ever made. Best investment, not girlfriend, not the woman I love. An investment. I sat down on the edge of our bed, the same bed we'd slept in for 12 years, And I read that sentence 4 or 5 times, until the letters stopped making sense as words and just looked like shapes. I want to be honest with you about something. My first instinct wasn't rage. It was a strange, cold clarity. The kind you get when a doctor tells you something serious and your brain just goes quiet and starts making a list. I needed proof. Not a screenshot I could have grabbed and typed myself if I were lying. Real, external, undeniable. Because I already knew what was coming for my campaign, and I was not going to let Vanessa and Colin Marsh control the timeline anymore. I called the one person in Richmond I trusted to get me that proof quietly. Walt Pruitt. 19 years with the Henrico County Sheriff's Office before he went private. Doing opposition research and financial forensics for campaigns too smart to run without knowing what was hiding under the hood. I'd used him twice before, for boring, legitimate things. Vetting a donor, checking a rumor about a zoning vote. He knew my voice well enough to know the second I called on a Sunday afternoon that something had actually happened. "Daniel," he told me, "you sound like a man who just found something he wishes he hadn't." "I need everything on my wife," I told him, "and on a man named Colin Marsh, and I need it fast. Walt, I've got maybe 6 days before something goes public that I can't control." A pause. Walt's the kind of man who takes his time before he agrees to something that's going to cost him sleep. "This isn't just going to be an affair file," he said finally. "If she's coordinating with Ashford's campaign manager on the timing of a document dump, this is bigger than a marriage problem." "I know," I told him. "That's exactly why I need it done right." He met me 2 hours later at a coffee shop off Carey Street, one of those places that used to be a hardware store before that whole stretch turned into condos and craft breweries. I laid out everything I'd found on the phone. Walt listened without writing much down, which I later learned was intentional. He never took notes where a stranger could glance over his shoulder. "Give me until Friday," he said, closing his laptop bag. "Daniel, don't confront her, not yet. The second she knows you know, she'll either destroy the evidence on her end or push Ashford to move the timeline up. Right now, you have something she doesn't know you have. Don't give that back." I didn't know it yet. Walt Pruitt was about to hand me something far bigger than an affair. He was about to hand me the fact that my marriage had never been what I thought it was. Not for one single day of it. The next 4 days were the strangest of my life. Because I had to keep showing up to my own marriage like nothing had changed. I made Eli's lunches. I sat across from Vanessa at dinner and asked about her day. She told me, without blinking, about a donor call she'd had that afternoon. The same call I now knew, where she and Colin had spent 40 minutes discussing how to phrase the leaked story so it would land on the front page the day after our anniversary. She was good. I'll give her that. 12 years of marriage, and I never once suspected she could lie to my face with that much warmth still in her eyes. Walt called me Thursday night, the day before our anniversary, and asked me to meet him at his office on Ironworks Row. When I walked in, there was a leather folder sitting on his desk, thicker than I expected. "Sit down," he told me. "This is going to take a while." The first section was exactly what I'd feared. Time-stamped messages, a handful of photographs from a hotel downtown, financial transfers between an account tied to Colin Marsh and a political consulting firm registered in Norfolk. Standard. Ugly, but survivable. Marriages end over less than that every day in this city. The second section is what changed everything. Walt had pulled records, public filings, old employment history, a database he still had access to from his sheriff's office years, and built a timeline going back to 2012, a full year before Vanessa and I got married. "Your wife wasn't working in strategic communications in 2012, Walt told me, sliding a page across the desk. She was on contract with a firm called Beacon Hill Consulting. Beacon Hill's only client that year was a real estate holding company owned by the Ashford family, Gordon Ashford's family, the same Ashfords I was running against. They don't do that kind of long game unless they think someone's worth the investment." Walt went on. "Somebody at Beacon Hill decided you were worth watching. Young, ambitious council aide, good instincts, clean record, the kind of guy who was going to be running for something bigger within a decade. They didn't send Vanessa to marry you for love, Daniel. They sent her to be positioned." I sat there with that folder in my hands, and something inside me went very quiet and very still. 12 years. She'd been inside my house, inside my family, inside my son's life, as an asset on somebody else's balance sheet. "There's one more thing," Walt said. And this was the part where his voice actually softened, which for a man like Walt Pruitt is saying something. "I found an old email exchange between Vanessa and a friend from around the time you two started dating. She never deleted her personal account from that era. Most people don't think to." He turned the page around so I could read it myself. "Vanessa, he's sweet. Kind of boring, honestly. But Beacon Hill says he's going places, 10 years, maybe less, and he's a councilman with real juice. Might as well marry the guy going somewhere instead of one of the guys going nowhere." I read it twice. Then I closed the folder. "I need you to do one more thing for me," I told Walt. "I need you to help me build something. Not just proof, a presentation. Something that plays start to finish in a room full of people, so there's no room left for her to spin it." Walt leaned back in his chair, studying me the way he probably used to study a suspect across an interview table. "You want to do this at the anniversary dinner," he said. It wasn't really a question. "She picked the timing to hurt my campaign," I told him. "I'm going to pick the timing to end her plan before it starts." I didn't know it yet. But the video Walt and I built over the next 18 hours wasn't just going to save my marriage from a lie. It was going to save an election, expose a family that thought they could buy the mayor's office through my bedroom. And it was going to start with the two of us sitting in a ballroom I'd rented for what I thought, 3 weeks earlier, would be the happiest night of the year. The Belmont Room, in the heart of the Fan District, holds 240 people comfortably. On the night of our 12th anniversary, every seat was filled. Donors, council colleagues, campaign volunteers, half of Vanessa's book club. It was, on paper, a celebration of our marriage. In practice, it had quietly become the launch event for my mayoral campaign, because Vanessa had insisted on inviting half my finance committee. I understand now why she wanted them there. A public humiliation lands so much harder with donors in the room to witness it. Gordon Ashford wasn't invited, obviously. Neither was Colin Marsh. That detail matters, because it means what happened that night wasn't staged by them. It was staged entirely by Vanessa, on her own. The moment she decided she couldn't wait 8 more days after all. Looking back, I think she'd started to suspect something was off in me. I'd been quieter that week, distracted, in a way I usually wasn't good at hiding. Maybe she panicked. Maybe she decided that humiliating me publicly, right there at our own anniversary, would be the story that led every news cycle, instead of whatever quiet financial leak she and Colin had originally planned. Either way. When I stood up to give my toast, she stood up first. "I've been disgusted by you since our first night together," she told the room. I watched 200 faces freeze mid-sip. "You want to know the truth? Daniel, I married a boring city council aide because somebody told me you'd be worth something someday. And I have spent 12 years waiting for you to actually become somebody. And you never did. You're still the same small, careful little man I met in 2012. A few gasps. My mother, sitting 3 tables back, went pale. Eli wasn't there, thank God. He was with my sister for the night, and I'm still grateful for that small mercy. Here's the part Vanessa didn't understand. She thought she was detonating a bomb in a room that had no idea it was coming. She had no idea I'd spent the last 2 days with Walt Pruitt building the real bomb, and that hers had just handed me the perfect moment to set it off. I smiled. I want to be honest, some of that smile was pure shock. Some of it was relief, because for 6 days I'd been carrying a secret I couldn't share with anyone. And finally, the moment had arrived where I didn't have to hold it alone anymore. I turned to the events director standing near the stage. I was be exactly where we'd rehearsed that afternoon. Gave her a small nod. "What is this?" Vanessa asked, her voice cracking for the first time. The lights dimmed. The screen behind the head table came alive. The first frame wasn't a wedding photo. It was a scanned copy of a Beacon Hill Consulting pay stub from October of 2012. Vanessa's name printed clearly across the top. Client field listing a holding company that anyone in Richmond real estate circles would immediately recognize as tied to the Ashford family. Beneath it, in Walt's careful red annotation, 6 months before Vanessa Reed began dating Daniel Whitfield, the room, which had been murmuring nervously about our fight, went completely silent. 12 years ago, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Somebody paid my wife to get close to me, not because they loved me, because they thought I might be useful someday. Turn it off, Vanessa said. Nobody moved to help her. The next slide was the email. Might as well marry the guy, going somewhere instead of one of the guys going nowhere. I let that sit on the screen for a full 10 seconds. I heard someone at the donor table quietly say, "Oh my God." "You want to talk about disgust?" I told her. "Let's talk about 8 days from now. When you and your boyfriend were planning to leak a fake donor file to the ledger, timed perfectly to destroy my campaign the morning after our anniversary." The screen shifted to the text thread. "Can't wait for the debrief tonight." Then the plan itself, laid out in her own words, time-stamped, dated 3 days before that very dinner. Just 8 more days. Let him have his stupid anniversary dinner. Vanessa's face had gone from pale to something closer to grey. She looked toward the ballroom doors, like she was calculating how many steps it would take to reach them. "His name is Colin Marsh," I told the room, because half of them had spent the evening being introduced by Vanessa as a friend from her old consulting days. "He's Gordon Ashford's campaign manager. My wife has been feeding my opponent internal campaign information for months, while planning to leak fabricated documents about me right before the filing deadline." Someone near the back, I later learned, it was a reporter from the Ledger who'd come as a +1 to one of my council colleagues, was already typing on her phone. I didn't stop her. I wanted this out. I wanted it out on my terms, in my words, before Vanessa or Colin or Gordon Ashford could shape it into anything else. "You don't get to control the story anymore," I told Vanessa. Quiet enough now that most of the room had to lean in to hear it. "You spent 12 years controlling it. Tonight, it's mine." She didn't answer. She picked up her clutch, walked past our table without looking at me, left through the side doors near the kitchen. Nobody clapped. Nobody laughed. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was the kind of silence a room makes when 200 people are all doing the same math at once. And none of them like the answer. I didn't know it yet, but that video would be online within 6 hours, uploaded by someone in that room who thought the public deserved to see exactly what kind of campaign the Ashford family was willing to run. By Monday morning, the story had a headline in the Ledger. "Council member's wife tied to rival campaign in alleged sabotage plot." By Wednesday, it had a follow-up, naming Colin Marsh directly. By the following week, Gordon Ashford had lost his co-chair of the County Realtors Association, a fundraising partner who wanted absolutely nothing to do with a scandal involving planted documents. Vanessa moved out that same week, into an apartment across the river, filed for separation before I could even file first. Her attorney sent a letter within days, demanding half of everything. Standard language, nothing that surprised me. What surprised me was how little it scared me, because by then, Walt Pruitt had already found something that made the entire question of half of everything almost beside the point. 2 weeks after the anniversary, I got a call from Renee Castillo, an estate attorney I hadn't spoken to since the funeral of my old mentor, Julian Voss, roughly 2 years earlier. Julian had been Richmond's mayor for 2 terms, back in the early 2000s, long before I ever ran for anything. He'd taken an interest in me back when I was still that boring council aide everyone underestimated. He passed away from a sudden heart condition, and I still missed him more than I let on to most people. "There's something in Julian's files I need you to see," Renee told me over the phone. "He left instructions that it only be opened if you ever ran for mayor, and something threatened the campaign in a serious way. Given what's in the news this week, I think we've reached that point." I met her at her office on East Grey Street that Friday. She pulled a sealed envelope from a locked drawer, my name written across the front. In handwriting I recognized immediately. Julian's careful, old-fashioned script. The kind of penmanship you don't see from anyone under 70 anymore. Inside was a letter, dated from more than a decade earlier. Not long after Vanessa and I had gotten engaged, Daniel, if you're reading this, it means the thing I quietly worried about back in 2013 finally came to pass. And I am sorry for that, because I know how much you love her. Or at least how much you believe you do. I never told you this at the time, because I had no proof, only instinct. And a lifetime in this city's politics has taught me instinct alone isn't worth breaking a young man's heart over. But I did what any careful old politician would do. I had a friend at the elections board quietly track every consulting contract tied to the Ashford family, going back 15 years, updated every couple of years, just in case. You'll find the most recent version attached. I also set aside a fund with Renee, an independent audit of your campaign finances, to be triggered automatically the day you file to run for mayor, so that no leaked document, real or fabricated, could ever catch you unprepared. Use it well. Julian. Attached was a financial audit trail Renee had already had, running quietly in the background. Since the day I filed my mayoral paperwork, 3 weeks before that anniversary. Every dollar my campaign had ever raised or spent, verified, time-stamped, cross-checked against county filings. Which meant the moment Vanessa and Colin's fabricated donor file surfaced anywhere, it would take investigators less than a day to prove it was fiction, because Julian Voss had built me an alibi before I even knew I'd need one. I sat in Renee Castillo's office and I laughed quietly. Alone. The way you laugh when grief and relief show up in the same breath. You old fox, you knew. Julian had never trusted Vanessa. Not from that very first dinner at his house back in 2013, when he pulled me aside and asked, almost too casually, where exactly she'd worked before we met. I'd brushed it off then. I understood it now. I didn't know it yet. But Julian's audit trail was about to do more than protect my campaign. It was about to hand the district attorney's office everything they needed to charge Colin Marsh, and eventually Gordon Ashford's campaign finance director, with conspiracy to commit election fraud. By September, the campaign had turned into something I genuinely didn't expect. Not a scandal I was surviving, a story voters were actively rewarding me for surviving well. Polling that had me down 6 points in April had me up 11 by Labour Day. People, it turned out, respond to a man who gets blindsided in public and doesn't fall apart. They respond even more to a man who had already built the proof to protect himself before the attack ever landed. But the story wasn't finished, because Gordon Ashford's campaign still had one card left to play, and it came from somewhere I genuinely hadn't expected. My own campaign co-chair, Preston Doyle. Preston had been with me for 6 years, since my second council run, a man I trusted enough to hand him the campaign's internal polling data every single week. During debate prep in the middle of September, Walt came to me with something that made my stomach turn a second time that year. Preston's been forwarding your internal polling and messaging strategy to a consulting address linked to Colin Marsh since March, Walt told me. Sliding printouts across a folding table in our campaign office on Carey Street. Before the anniversary, before any of this became public, he was Vanessa's second line into your campaign, in case the first one ever got cut off. I confronted Preston the next evening, in the same conference room where we'd built debate strategy together a dozen times. I didn't yell. I'd learned by then that quiet worked better than loud. Why? I asked him, and I genuinely wanted to know. Gordon offered me a deputy chief of staff position if he won, Preston admitted, not even bothering to deny it, once he saw Walt's printouts. I figured you were going to lose to the scandal anyway. I was just hedging. You were betting against me the same week I found out my wife had been betting against me for 12 years, I told him. That's a hell of a coincidence, Preston. He didn't have anything to say to that. I let him resign quietly, rather than turn it into another headline. Not out of kindness, because I'd learned something from Vanessa's mistake. The story lands harder when you control exactly how and when it comes out. I gave the polling leak details to Walk's contact at the district attorney's office instead, and let the legal system do what the cameras didn't need to see. Election night landed in the first week of November. I won the race for mayor of Richmond with 58% of the vote, a margin that would have been unthinkable back in April, when my own wife stood up at our anniversary dinner and told 200 people I was disgusting. Colin Marsh was indicted in late autumn on charges connected to campaign finance fraud and conspiracy. Based largely on the documentation Walt Pruitt and Julian Voss's audit trail had assembled between them. Gordon Ashford's campaign quietly folded before the general election was even certified. Gordon himself stepped back from Richmond politics entirely, moving, according to the Ledger, to manage his family's real estate holdings full-time instead. Vanessa's separation became a finalized divorce by the following spring. Given the financial fraud tied to Colin Marsh, her attorney's original demand for half of everything evaporated into something considerably smaller. Once the courts finished sorting out what money in our marriage had ever actually been clean, I got full custody of Eli. With Vanessa receiving a standard supervised visitation arrangement, the family court judge described it as being in the child's best interest. Given the ongoing federal investigation into his mother's finances, Eli's 12 now, still thinks my job involves too many boring meetings, has started asking sharper questions than an 11-year-old should have to ask, about why his mom doesn't come to his soccer games anymore. I answer them honestly, in pieces small enough for him to carry, because I refuse to raise him the way I was almost raised, into believing that silence is the same thing as protecting the people you love. A few weeks after the inauguration, René Castillo came by my office with one more envelope, this one from Julian Voss's original files, something she'd apparently held back until she was certain I could handle it without letting it change how I governed. It was a photo of Julian and me from 2013, taken at his house, the same night he pulled me aside to ask about Vanessa's old employer. On the back, in that same careful handwriting, "Told you he'd make a good mayor someday. Some men just need the right kind of disaster to prove it to themselves." I keep that photo in the top drawer of my desk at City Hall now, not as a trophy, as a reminder that somebody believed in the man I could become, years before I believed it myself. And that belief, quietly protected in a locked drawer for over a decade, mattered more in the end than anything Vanessa or Gordon Ashford ever tried to take from me. Here's what I've learned, and I say this to anyone listening who's ever had someone they trusted decide quietly that the relationship was never really about them. Betrayal doesn't get to define the rest of your story. Only your response does. I used to think being a good husband, a good councilman, a good man in general, meant staying calm, staying quiet, never making the room uncomfortable. I know better now. Real strength isn't staying silent while someone plans your downfall in the dark. It's building your own proof, on your own timeline, choosing exactly when and how the truth finally gets to speak for you. You don't owe anyone your silence, especially not the people who spent years counting on it. Sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't loud. It's a locked drawer, a quiet folder, a patient man, and a room full of people who finally get to see exactly who you really are, while the person who tried to destroy you is left explaining herself to everyone who once believed her instead. If you've ever had to hold a secret like that, quietly, for days, while still showing up like nothing had changed, I'd love to hear how you got through it. Drop it in the comments. And if this one kept you hooked, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.